Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Plutarch's short treatise on being a busybody could actually be titled How Not to Be and Why Not to Be a Busybody, and he's going to offer us some very helpful advice about how we can train ourselves or develop ourselves into people who will not be succumbing to this idle and morbid curiosity or inquisitiveness that goes into this disposition of being a busybody, which is not good for other people, it's not good for ourselves, and it can actually get us in a lot of trouble. So he's got a number of suggestions for us about how you might develop or train yourself that we're going to look at shortly. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the kind of shared vocabulary in this section towards the end of the work and some of the key terms and ideas. So the first thing to begin with is, what are we actually driving at? So he uses two different terms. The first one that he brings up is the opposite of akrasia, enkrateia, and we can translate it as self-control. That's probably one of the best translations of it. It means self-mastery, being able to resist temptations. Now, it doesn't mean not having temptations. It means being able to say, no, I shouldn't do this. And there's another state that gets discussed a little bit later. In the translation that I have here, it gets rendered as continence, but that's kind of an old-fashioned term that doesn't entirely convey what we're talking about. It's sophrosune, and that can be translated very directly as temperance, moderation, which is one of the virtues. And it's actually, for most ancient philosophers, one of the cardinal virtues. So that's a bit more than having self-control, because it implies a fuller development of good character where you actually don't desire to have things that you shouldn't enjoy, you shouldn't indulge, right? You can say, no, that's not for me. Whereas the self-controlled person, there's a bit of themselves that does want to, in the case of curiosity, go and check out what somebody's doing, but they pull themselves back. They refrain from doing it. They exercise that self-control. And for Plutarch, again, as for most ancient philosophers, the way in which you become better is not by just having the right ideas and then everything falls into place, or praying to the gods and then they infuse you with some sort of divine grace. You have to work on yourself. You have to train, or accustom is one way it's translated, or habituate yourself. And so we see a lot of ethical language, and I'm making a little bit of a joke there. Ethos means habit, right? And it's the word that we get ethics from, because ancient ethics was very concerned with the habits that we develop. So habituation, ethismos can be translated as habituation or as a habit. Ethidzometha, ethises, these are both verbs that are denoting the process of habituating ourselves or yourself. And then there's another term that comes up, sun ethisteon, and this means something that one should develop a habit about. And you notice the sun there, like you're consolidating things, not just developing a habit, but developing, let's call it a panoply of habits. So that's quite important. Early on in the portion, he's going to talk about training and teaching ourselves. So these are both verbs. And he's saying let us do this. So gymnazomen, right? So gymnazein means to engage in gymnastics, the bodily exercises, not just what we think of as gymnastics, really all the stuff that you would do in a gymnasium, our days, doing cardio, lifting weights, playing with the ropes, taking classes. All of that is conditioning, right? And so what we do physically is actually quite important here. And then didaskomen, so didaskein is to teach, didaskomen to teach ourselves. And how do we do that? By, reading things and thinking about them and reflecting on them, looking at good examples. Then there's another term that he uses at a number of places in this. You may be quite familiar with it. It's the word that we get ascetic from, and it can be translated as training or as discipline, ascesis. Very, very important term in ancient virtue ethics. The notion is we need to work on ourselves over and over and over again in consistent ways. And if we do that, then we are going to develop these proper habits. That's how we habituate ourselves to have self-control or temperance with respect to curiosity or inquisitiveness, polupragmosunēs, right? So how can we do this? All right, here's where we get down to concrete suggestions. And this is really excellent stuff here. So he says, let's first begin with the most trifling and unimportant matters. You're taking a walk and you happen to go by tombs. You don't need to read the inscriptions. He says, what difficulty is there about refraining from reading the inscriptions on the tombs, right? We don't have to look and see who died or what people said about them. Or just glancing at the writing on walls. It was quite common to do some graffiti when we take our walks. How can we do this? Just remind ourselves, keep in mind, right, that nothing useful or pleasant has been written there. Merely so-and-so commemorates so-and-so, wishing him well, and somebody else is the best of friends. And much twaddle of this sort. Stuff that has nothing to do with us. Right? So if somebody happened to write, we go in the bathroom, somebody's written something in the bathroom stall, that's not concerning us, right? Unless they're actually like naming us by name, the odds of that are pretty darn low. So, keeping ourselves from looking at stuff that we don't need to look at. And he says, so it may seem that there's no harm from reading these, but you're instilling the practice of searching out matters that aren't your business. So don't do it. He's got another very, very concrete suggestion. You're walking along. Don't look in other people's doorways. That's their business. You don't need to see what's going on in their house. He says, we don't want with our curious gaze to clutch at what is happening within. Instead, let's say it's no difference whether it's the feet or eyes that we set within another's house. What the eyes behold is neither just nor honorable, nor even pleasant, since the greater part of what we see inside is, kitchen utensils lying about and servant girls sitting in idleness. We don't need to be looking at other people's living arrangements, their place, at least not with strangers or neighbors. Okay, so that's another great suggestion. He talks about sidelong glances, and he's got a really funny example here. And the words that he's using, he talks about turning the soul, twisting the soul with our glances where we're looking off at the side. So he says, Diogenes saw this Olympic victor, Dioxippus, making his triumphal entry in his chariot, right? So he's the one who's riding along. Everybody's looking at him. He's supposed to be focusing on the fact that he's having a triumph. What's he doing? Well, there's some woman who attracted his eye, and he keeps like looking over at her, And so Diogenes says, see how a slip of a girl gets a stranglehold on our athlete? And Plutarch goes on and says, you may observe how every kind of spectacle gets a stranglehold on busybodies and twists their necks around once they acquire a habit and practice of scattering their glances in all directions. Let's not let our senses be like that. We don't have to allow ourselves to be distracted by everything, let alone, sneaking little glances over there, right? That's not our business again. We should stick to what is really important. He goes on and tells us that there's other things that we need to avoid as well. This is really quite good. When people are reviling and abusing each other in the marketplace, right? When they're saying mean things to each other, when they're involved in conflict. That's not our business. We don't need to get involved in that. We certainly don't, in this present day, need to get on our phones and start recording it and uploading it to, streaming live on Instagram or Facebook or whatever you want, right? We don't need to be doing that. That's their problem. Unless you're directly involved in the conflict, it's not your conflict. You don't need to get yourself mixed up in it. He says, when a crowd is running to see something or other, sit your butt down. Don't get up and go see what they're looking at. And then he's got another great piece here. He says, hey, listen, if you don't have self-control, well, then get up and go away. Go somewhere else. You're not going to reap any advantage from mixing yourself with busybodies. You will obtain benefit by turning aside your curiosity, curtailing it, and training it to obey reason. And then he says, all right, so those are the beginning level things. Now we can actually intensify the training. How do we do that? Well, we deliberately, when we pass by something that's really tempting for us, we don't indulge in it. So he says, when we pass by a theater where a successful performance is in progress, when our friends urge us to see a certain dancer or a comedian, we just keep going. We don't go into that. When shouts are heard on the race course or in the circus, don't turn around. And he says, Socrates used to advise the avoidance of such foods that tempt us to eat when we're not hungry and such drinks that tempt us to imbibe when we're not thirsty. We should avoid and guard against such sights and sounds that master and attract us without fulfilling any need of our own. So how would we do this today? We're probably not walking by and we hear, a concert going on. We're constantly going in places where somebody's got something on the stupid TV. You can't go to a doctor's office. You can't go to, sometimes even libraries have televisions and the librarian's looking at the TV over there. You don't have to be like, oh, what's on? Mind your own damn business. It's not important. Now, he also talks about attractive people, and this is in terms of beautiful women, but we could apply this to anybody that you might find beguiling or attractive. So he says that Cyrus the Great was unwilling to see Panthea, and when Araspes declared the woman's beauty was worth seeing, Cyrus said, yeah, that's exactly why I'm not going to go see her. If I was persuaded by you, I would go to her and then she might tempt me. And I don't have the time to go see her and sit by her to the neglect of important matters. Alexander the Great, kind of a screw up, but at least he succeeded in this. He wouldn't go to see Darius's wife, who was said to be very beautiful. He did visit her mother, but he wouldn't go see the young and beautiful daughter. And he says, but we peep into women's litters and hang around their windows and think we're doing nothing wrong, in thus making our curiosity prone to slip and slide into all kinds of vice, right? So, you see something beautiful, you don't have to look at it. It's not really your business. we can kick it up a notch, and we can say, well, the stuff that really is in my purview, up to me, in my house, I can even refrain from that sometimes because it can be good for me. So he says, for the attainment of justice, dikaiosunes, you might sometimes forego an honest gain so that you can accustom yourself to keep clear of dishonest profit, right? You can sometimes keep aloof from your own wife so that you may never be stirred by another's. So, we're not yet to curiosity yet. So just because you can engage in something, sometimes you shouldn't do every business deal, right? That's good for you not to hold back. Same thing with, so that you don't get lustful with other people's spouses. You don't always have to be screwing your own spouse, right? And everything be sexy time all the time. Now, how does this apply to curiosity? He says that you can apply this to inquisitiveness and try not to hear or see some of the things that actually do concern you. So, for example, when somebody wishes to tell you something that happened in your house, put them off and refuse to hear words that are supposed to have been spoken about you. And he says, somebody who didn't do this is the tragic hero Oedipus. He couldn't leave well enough alone. He was king. Now, turned out that he'd killed his blood father, married his mother, but he didn't have to know that. He just kept picking and picking and picking till finally he compelled the seer Tiresias to say, hey, buddy, that's what the score is. And then, of course, it brings down the entire house. He could have just left well enough alone. So he says, for people who have this curiosity, it's like the itching of a sore which gets bloody whenever we scratch it. But if you can get rid of that disease, you're actually going to be quite happy. And then the last thing that he says that I think is really interesting, slow down the information that you're getting. So he talks about when a letter is brought to us, do we open it up right away? We don't get a lot of letters these days. Do you have to open every email as soon as it comes? Do you have to check your phone constantly to see whether anybody's, saying something to you or about you? You can let it go. It doesn't have to be checked right away. He says that some people will bite through the fastenings of a letter if their hands are too slow. When a messenger arrives from somewhere or another, don't rush up or even rise to our feet. When a friend says, I have something new to tell you, say, I would prefer you had something useful or profitable. And he gives a really funny example here. He's lecturing in Rome, and there's this guy, Rusticus, and a soldier comes through the audience and delivers him a letter from the emperor. There was a silence. I, too, made a pause that he might read the letter. He refused and didn't break the seal until I'd finished my lecture and the audience had dispersed. And so everyone was like, wow, this guy has some self-control, right? He doesn't have to find out right away what's going on. And so if we can do these things, we will develop habits that eventually consolidate into having self-control and perhaps even the virtue of temperance that allows us to not just control ourselves, but to want to do that sort of thing. So these are some really great suggestions on Plutarch's part for how we can develop our self-control over this curiosity that might otherwise lead to lack of self-control or even to a vicious disposition that's bad for us to have.